and welcome to the 59th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have almost reached the end of this course, but we are discussing some important ideas, and I hope that these two remaining lectures will be a good introduction to a very complex and interesting set of concerns. In our discussion of the life and work of Derek Walcott, I have already hinted at a discussion of the post-colonial era and how poetry was written and consumed in this very important cultural and political conjuncture of our times. We will extend that discussion and by wrapping up our study of Derek Walcott in the first few minutes of this lecture, and then move on to the work of another very important and powerful poet whose name is Arun Kolatkar. To wrap up our discussion of Walcott, I want to think about a term and a phrase coined by another poet, a very important poet, and about whom we have already talked at great length earlier in the course. The poet is T.S. Eliot, and the term that he coined is the mythic method. This phrase was first coined in T.S. Eliot's review of the novel Ulysses by the writer James Joyce. This novel was published in the year 1922, and a year after that, in the year 1923, T.S. Eliot wrote the essay titled Ulysses, Order and Myth. This was published in the magazine The Dial. It was a short piece, but it proved to be quite influential. In this short and influential piece, Eliot articulated what he saw was a defining innovation of modernist literature. And he thought that this was done by a unique combination of elements in James Joyce's novel Ulysses. The quote from T.S. Eliot reads thus: "In using the myth, in manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, Mr. Joyce is pursuing a method which others must pursue after him. It is simply a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history." So, what is the meaning of this phrase? Let us think a little bit about it. Eliot is essentially arguing that modern life is so fragmented and it is so splintered by the dislocations of modernity, which include but are not limited to the devastation of the First World War, the great alienation produced by living in cities, the breakdown of religious and cultural certainties, among other things. Such a time, it lacked the clear narrative structures that had once given meaning to existence. So earlier, stories could be told based on a few assumptions that could always be held to be true. But in the modern era, it was very difficult to assume anything about life anymore. In this context, when religion, culture, and really the certainty of life fails to give that base or strong foundation to life, what can the writer or the poet do? According to Eliot, in this context, poets could fall back on myths. Myths meaning the stories written in ancient Greece and Rome. Stories told by poets like Homer. The myth could serve as a scaffolding, according to Eliot, onto which modern experiences could be mapped, giving shape to otherwise chaotic, directionless realities. So what is the myth, and how does Joyce's novel merit the phrase, the mythic method? In the novel Ulysses, James Joyce parallels the mundane events of a single day in Dublin with episodes from Homer's Odyssey. The protagonist of Joyce's novel, Leopold Bloom, becomes a modern-day Odysseus. Odysseus, of course, is the protagonist of Homer's Odyssey. In Joyce's novel, the modern-day equivalent of Odysseus also travels. While Odysseus was traveling across oceans to return home, in Joyce's novel, Leopold Bloom wanders through the city and, in fact, has a very almost pathetic correspondence to the epic travels of Odysseus. Bloom's travels in Joyce's novel are through banal and fragmentary spaces of the city of Dublin. This is not exactly a heroic landscape, but the effect of the novel is that first readers notice the vast difference between the kind of heroic journey undertaken by Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey and the very, very non epic or ordinary journey undertaken by Leopold Bloom in Ulysses, that is Joyce's novel. But by the time the novel ends, it's the detail, the description, the manner in which Joyce describes Bloom's wandering through the city of Dublin in 1922. The readers are convinced that this is also a heroism of a different sort. It is not heroism or it is not epic in quite the same way as Homer's epic was heroic. But nonetheless, the travelings of Leopold Bloom are also quite epic in their own way. That is the achievement of Joyce's novel, which is the reason why Eliot finds that Joyce's novel has justified the praise or the description mythic method. For T.S. Eliot, Joyce's use of Homer's Odyssey was not a nostalgic use of a classic Greek story, but rather it was a way of reactivating ancient structures to give coherence and depth to the modern condition. There are theoretical implications for why the mythic method matters. The mythic method speaks to several modernist concerns. On one hand, it speaks to the crisis of representation, and especially in post-colonial contexts. Representation is in crisis because the modes of representation are connected to a European and colonial history of violence. Representation is also in crisis because artists are confused about what exactly in the modern world, also in the post-colonial world, should be the ideal or desired subject of representation. What should be represented? Right? Myth clarifies that doubt because it says the modern world may appear to be not worthy of representation, but if it is connected to a myth, then it becomes worthy of representation. In fact, the whole point of art is to bridge the gap between the chaos that artists find around them, which appears to be unworthy of art, and to turn that through the mode of cognition, through their ways of perceiving that very chaotic reality, through the prism of classical and mythic stories. It also helps artists negotiate cultural exhaustion in the face of continual renewal. Myth connects modern artists to the deep time of civilization, offering a counterpoint to fragmentation. Artists realize that they are living in a continuous chronological tradition, a tradition that stretches all the way from ancient Greece to 20th century England, Europe, or even the post-colonial world. So the myth gives artists a way of telling new stories. It is not simply a repetition of the old story. It is not a repetition of the myth. Neither is it simply a description of the chaotic modern world. Rather, it is a synthesis. It is a reciprocal reshaping of both the meaning of myth in the present time, as well as a selection and a recreation of aspects of a chaotic present through the prism of the myth. There's a great deal of irony and displacement as well. Modern characters are often comically, pathetically, or heroically out of joint with their mythic stereotypes. This is also an important area for artists to explore. Leopold Bloom is no Odysseus, but his journey is no less epic in its own diminished way. Myth universalizes the particularities of modern life, granting trivial events symbolic weight. So, these are some of the uses of the mythic method in contemporary times. This example that T.S. Eliot uses of James Joyce's novel Ulysses, there are many other examples that go much further than Ulysses, and in fact, the text that we have been discussing, Derek Walcott's Omeros, is a prime example of the mythic method. There are other examples of modernist texts which evoke the stories as well as the classical structures of myths. Some of these include Mrs. Dalloway, which includes very subtle allusions to Greek tragedy and the structure of ritual. William Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury, draws on biblical and classical motifs to structure the decline of the American South. Herman Brock's text, The Death of Virgil, aligns the death of the poet Virgil with the crisis of European civilization. In post-colonial literature, the mythic method assumes a great deal of power. The mythic method often becomes a tool for reclaiming or reconfiguring indigenous and colonial myths. Derek Walcott's Omeros, which we have been discussing, rewrites Homer through the lens of Caribbean history. The Nigerian writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between, published in the year 1965, frames colonial encounters through African myths of land and initiation. Now, we'll spend some time talking about epic similes before wrapping up our discussion. Homer used a literary device which is today known as the epic simile. These are famous for their length, their vivid detail, and the use of everyday experience to illuminate the action of the poem. These similes typically slow down the narrative at moments of high tension or drama, offering elaborate comparisons to natural phenomena, animals, farming, or common human activities. They are one of the hallmarks of Homer's style and are deeply influential on later epic poetry. This is an example from Homer's The Iliad, that is Book 2, lines 455 to 464, in the translation by Robert Fagles. In this moment in the Iliad, Agamemnon is mustering the Greek forces for battle. As the soldiers gather, Homer compares the Greek army to swarming bees. This is the epic simile. And the earth groaned beneath them as they went, and they made a noise as great as when innumerable flocks of birds rise crying together, startled from the sands beside a great lake, and fly wheeling and circling, exulting in their wings flutter. Now, what makes this an epic simile? The poet is describing the movement of soldiers, but while comparing the movement of soldiers to the poet describes how the earth groaned, and the groaning of the earth under the soldiers' feet is described as the sound of innumerable flocks of birds starting to fly immediately. They're both crying as well as the flapping of wings. This creates a large and very loud sound. But instead of returning to the image of the soldiers walking, the poet stays with the image and keeps describing exactly what these birds are doing. This is an epic simile because of the extended comparison. The gathering army is compared not briefly, but through an elaborate multi-part image, first to swarming bees and then to flocks of birds. There is a very vivid imagery. Homer provides visual, auditory, and kinetic detail. The buzzing of bees, the cries of birds, the earth groaning under the weight. The simile draws on everyday experiences familiar to Homer's audience, who will know exactly what these birds, bees, and other aspects of nature mean and their relevance. There's also an emotional resonance. While the Greek army is a terrifying war machine, The simile evokes natural beauty, abundance, and even joy, thus complicating the tone. The function of the simile is to slow down the narrative for reflection and visualization. It connects the grandeur of war to natural cyclical processes, suggesting both inevitability as well as futility. The simile also elevates ordinary phenomena to an epic scale and makes the extraordinary human by comparison. Now, just like we have discussed these examples of epic similes in Homer, similarly, there are very powerful instances of epic similes in Walcott's Omeros. I will simply name these three instances and then move on. And I invite you all to explore these in your own reading of Walcott's very, very powerful text, Omeros. So, the first epic simile, or the first notable epic simile, this is not an exhaustive list, it is simply a selective list. One epic simile occurs in the first book and in chapter 9. The second occurs in chapter 7 of the same book, which is titled The Sail and the Fish's Fin. And finally, the third notable epic simile can be found in chapter 32, book 4, which I've called The Surf and the Hymn. After discussing the work of Derek Walcott, we'll quickly move on to the last poet in this series of 20th century poetry. The name of this poet is Arun Kolatkar. Kolatkar was a bilingual poet from Maharashtra who published in both Marathi and English. Kolatkar is an indispensable figure of post-colonial Indian modernism. Kolatkar's writing unravels the mythology of both religion and the city. His most important and well-known collection is titled Jejuri. It was published in the year 1976, and it is a very notable work in Indian English writing. It's a travelogue in verse, it is a skeptical pilgrimage, and finally it is also a minimalist and observational text grounded in irony and detachment. Kolatkar was born in the year 1931 in the town of Kolhapur in Maharashtra. Kolatkar moved to Bombay, now Mumbai, studied at the Sir J.J. School of Art, and worked in advertising and graphic design. His visual sensibility is key to understanding his poetry. Part of the Marathi Little Magazine movement, but wrote Jejuri in English. Kolatkar was deeply connected to the literary culture of poets and writers who were working in Marathi, and himself also composed a lot of poems in Marathi. But he also translated these poems himself and sometimes recomposed them as English versions. So he's truly a bilingual poet and is quite a remarkable figure in that right. He's among the most accomplished, most powerful bilingual creative writers in 20th century India. He was also deeply influenced by European and American modernism, cited among his influences both T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, but also other writers from other traditions, such as the Marathi Bhakti poetry tradition. Kolatkar describes the house in which he grew up in Kolhapur in these words. He says, "I grew up in a house with 9 rooms that were arranged well, almost like a house of cards. That is, there were more rooms at the bottom and less rooms at the top." His education was in visual arts. After matriculating in the year 1947, Kolatkar attended art school in Kolhapur, and then in the year 1949 joined the Sir J.J. School of Art in Bombay. He did not stay to complete the course, however. He left that course in 2 years later and returned only in 1957 when he completed the assignments and finally took the diploma in painting. Kolatkar lived a double life. He was an erudite, sharp, and witty poet and a thoroughly professional advertising writer at the same time. The two roles shaped each other reciprocally, and it is certainly very profitable to read his poems as visual compositions, as are his advertising campaigns. However, any cross-fertilization between these two positions remained private, as Kolatkar did not actively combine these two roles or place them in any sort of dialogue. It was only much later, towards the end of his life and after his death, that fellow poets, who also turned into his biographers, began to find connections between these two related but separate roles. From the early 1950s, Kolatkar began writing and slowly also publishing poems in English, and shortly after that in Marathi as well. For the next 50 years, Kolatkar sustained a consistently bilingual creative writing career. His publication history is slightly complicated, and it has only recently been pieced together in the year 2010 by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who edited the book Collected Poems in English by Arun Kolatkar, a book that was published by Blood Axe Books. In the introduction to this book, an essay titled Death of a Poet, Mehrotra describes how, in his last days, when Kolatkar was ailing from stomach cancer and lay dying in his flat in Pune, Mehrotra visited him, and through careful conversations, questions, answers, and a sort of sensitive detective work, Mehrotra pieced together the poet's early career. This was a time when Kolatkar had just graduated from art school, or left without graduating, had just come out of art school, and was full of a lot of contradictory ideas. He was extremely dissatisfied with the world around him, both the professional, capitalist, middle class world of Bombay, as well as the cultured, educated circles of artists, painters, and critics in which he had already begun to place one foot. It was in this period of confusion that Kolatkar began to think of poetry and took the first steps in establishing himself as a poet. He cleared a lot of ground, emotionally speaking, and even though it would be a long time before he could actually lay the foundations for his career as a poet. It was during this early period of confusion and also a never to be repeated combination of fearlessness and innocence that Kolatkar wrote some of his earliest poems. He wrote poems both in English and in Marathi, but these poems were not published in any books. They were published in local magazines with very limited circulation, sometimes only among fellow poets and enthusiasts. To the global Anglophone reading public, Kolatkar's career began with the publication of the volume Jejuri, as I've mentioned, in the year 1976. This book was published in Bombay and London and won the Commonwealth Prize in Poetry. Immediately, it put Kolatkar on the world map of English poetry. It was and is a remarkable collection. There is nothing else like it. A series of poems about an English-speaking poet's bus ride to a temple town in rural Maharashtra, full of lifelike, unforgettable portraits of ordinary people, bringing to life the sights, sounds, and the aura of small-town India, Jejuri stands alone. And if one accounts for the eloquence with which Kolatkar uses the English language and the sharpness with which Kolatkar synthesizes imagism, as well as metaphysical wit, to create extremely compressed vignettes of pathos, one realizes that Jejuri establishes Kolatkar as among the most powerful poets working in the English language to emerge from the Indian subcontinent. After Jejuri, Kolatkar did not publish any books until July 2004, when he published a series of poems titled Kala Ghoda Poems and Sarpasatra. While these are important collections, in order to understand Kolatkar's oeuvre, it's important to revisit some early poems that he composed during those early years after college. These poems, for some reason, escaped publication and anthologization, and therefore official recognition during his lifetime. The posthumous collection, The Boat Ride and Other Poems, was published in the year 2008, which is when, again, through the editorialship of A.K. Mehrotra, these poems, very important poems, came to light. As we learn from Mehrotra's work, among the earliest poems that Kolatkar wrote during this time, in the 50s, and which were first published after Kolatkar's death uh, in the volume Boat Ride and Other Poems, published 2008. Some of these poems included The Renunciation of the Dog and The Turnaround. The first of this, the Renunciation of the Dog, was part of a series of 14 English poems that Kolatkar later called the Journey Poems. They all emerged from one experience, that is, a walking trip that Kolatkar took with one of his painter and artist friends in the year 1953. In 1967, Kolatkar wrote a Marathi poem summarizing, taking stock of, and remembering that walking trip. And he composed this poem in Marathi, and it was titled Mumbaina Bhikes Lavla. He translated it into English, this poem, but did not publish it because he remained dissatisfied with the English translation of the name of a particular flower he had observed during his walk, and which he had described in the Marathi original as Vishnukranta. In his draft of the English version translation, which Kolatkar titled The Turnaround, Kolatkar had used the word daisies for the Marathi original word Vishnukranta. But he was not satisfied with the word. He read out this version at the Stockholm Literary Festival in the year 1987. And here is the poem in its entirety. The Turnaround by Arun Kolatkar. Bombay makes me a beggar. Kalyan gave me a lump of jaggery to suck in a small village that had a waterfall but no name. My blanket found a buyer, and I feasted on just plain, ordinary water. I arrived in Nasik with people leaves between my teeth. There I sold my tukaram to buy myself some bread and mince. When I turned off Agra Road, one of my chappals gave up the ghost. I gave myself a good bath in a little stream. I knocked on the first door I came upon, asked for a handout, and left the village. I sat down under a tree, hungry no more, but thirsty like never before. I gave my name, etc., to a man in a bullock cart who hated beggars and quoted Tukaram, but who, when we got to his farm later, was kind enough to give me a cool drink of water. Then came Rotegaon, where I went on trial and I had to drag the carcass away when, howling all night, a dog died in the temple when I was trying to get some sleep. There I got bhakri to eat all right, but something happens after this which I will not read because the language is highly unparliamentary. I could smell molasses boiling up in a field. I asked for some sugarcane to eat. Again, there's a description of scatological details which I will skip. Further, the poet goes, it was walk, walk, and walk all the way. It was the year of famine. I saw a dead bullock. I crossed a hill. I picked up a small coin from a temple on top of that hill. Kopargaon is a big town. That's where I read that Stalin was dead. Kopargaon is a big town, but it seemed shameful to beg, and I had to knock on 5 doors to get half a handful of rice. Dust in my beard, dust in my hair, the sun like a hammer on the head. A night spent on flagstones, my tin-shot hejira was hotting up. The station 2 miles ahead of me, the town 3 miles behind. I stopped to straighten the dhoti that had bunched up in my crotch when sweat stung my eyes and I could see. A low fence by the roadside, a clean-swept yard, a hut, an old man, a young woman in a doorway. I asked for some water and cupped my hands to receive it. Water dripping down my elbows, I looked at the old man, the goodly beard, the contentment that showed in his eyes, the cut-up can of kerosene that lay prostrate before him. A bhakri arrived, unbidden, with an onion for companion. I ate it up. I picked up the haversack I was sitting on. I thought about it for a mile or two, but I knew already that it was time to turn around. So this is the poem. In different versions, Kolatkar changes some of the words. This is the version that Kolatkar read out in Stockholm. In versions that were published, Kolatkar replaces the word bhakri with chapati. Uh, in his deathbed interviews with Mehrotra, from which I have quoted earlier, Kolatkar gave a few details that help us understand the context for these two poems. For both this one and the other important one from this phase, which is titled The Renunciation of the Dog. This poem is about a walking trip through western Maharashtra, as I mentioned earlier, and Kolatkar gives the names of some of the towns he passes through, that is Kalyan, Nasik, Rotegaon, and Kopargaon. Far from being a pleasant excursion, though it has its light moments, the trip turned out to be an ordeal. We will continue our discussion of the context of this poem, which describes an important, formative stage in the growth of Arun Kolatkar's career as a poet, and also read a couple of poems from Jejuri in the next lecture, and which will also conclude this course. Thank you.